As we begin the sermon, I want to talk with you a little bit about an experience my daughter and I had. My daughter's first job out of college was to be the assistant director of a prominent Christian camp, one you've probably heard of here in Southern California. And shortly after she started, the main director had some crises, and Katie ended up taking the whole thing over. That first summer, she just kept her head above water, but heading into the second year, she started to think about the story that their camp was telling of what their good news was, what their gospel was. And she realized that their gospel wasn't actually good news, or at least one that little kids would perceive as good news. In each camp, they had a whole thing figured out that each camp, the narrative was supposed to begin with convincing the children of their own sinfulness and their utter apartness from God. And Katie started to think, I'm not sure that the first thing that a 6-year-old needs to learn about God is that they're sinners and that they failed God and that God's a long way off from them. How does that make us, a 6-year-old, feel connected to a good and gracious God? But she struggled with the way that the camp wanted to talk about this, and also struggled with it because she and I both come out of a Christian setting that followed, this was the Romans Road approach to understanding how we come to be saved, that's supposed to be based on the book of Romans, that, just talks about we're sinners, and then God later on talks about how God saves us. And you've probably been around enough to know that approach, that we're sinners, that we're irretrievably lost, and that God has graciously decided to save us, and we can accept this salvation by faith. Now, you've also heard that some Christians try to qualify this by saying, well, God's really only decided to save some of us, and that God only kind of provisionally saves us and accepts us. But what Katie and I came to realize together was that this understanding of the gospel is using Romans in perhaps to make a different point than Romans itself was actually trying to make. We ended up having a series of conversations, several of which took place at the Little Red Hen near Patrick and Abby's new house. It's no longer there. It was one of the places we lost in the fire. And so some of the key memories I lost in the fire, nothing like you guys that actually lost things, but these conversations with my daughter were at a place that were lost. And what we came to realize was that the message of Romans was actually friendlier and more gracious and more generous than we realized up to this point. Now, I want to recognize that there is a level of self-confidence that borders on hubris to stand up here and tell you that in a few short reflections, my daughter and I figured out things that people for centuries in the church thought otherwise about. But what we were actually doing was finding out ways that Christians have always thought about Romans, but just weren't part of the traditions that we had been part of. And so we weren't tapping into something new, or I'm perfectly capable of overconfidence and hubris. But in this case, we were kind of stumbling our way into looking at this text in a way that Christians have looked at it from the beginning. Not all Christians in not all places, but it's always been part of the Christian tradition. And as I've continued to live with that, I think it's a more faithful way to actually listen to what God is trying to tell us in this particular text. So I'm hoping today that we could start a similar path and come out with a better understanding of just how good the good news of the gospel is for us. We're going to look together, starting today, at Romans 4 through 7, which is admittedly some of the most densely argued parts of the Bible, but that's what Claire wanted to do, so here we are. And I think we're going to find out that the good news is even better than we think. Okay, flip my notes. Now I'm lost. Hang on a second. Okay. So, short introduction to the book of Romans. A little bit of throat clearing for the first series in this sermon in the series. So, the book of Romans was written to try to unify and shape a community that came from very diverse and seemingly unreconcilable parts. There's evidence that there was both rich and poor people in the community, and the community was significantly divided between people who were Jews and Gentiles. But it also meant that it was divided between multiple understandings of what it meant to be a Jew, and many, many understandings of the world that the Gentile members brought to the community with them. Paul's task in writing to his friends in Rome was to create a unified community out of these disparate and even contradictory understandings. And it's not impossible, or sometimes not even hard to do this if one's willing to create a community around a common set of hatreds or fears or difference between us and a targeted other. I mean, gosh, an example, this being Pride Month, is a clear example of this is the way that some people have decided to very specifically target trans people in the last several years to create a sense of unity over and against this demonized and tiny number of other folks. Especially in my world, in athletics, there are more Epstein victims than there are trans NCAA athletes ever. That's off my chest. All right. So Paul wants to create a community that is not formed by common grievances or fears or hatreds, but one that shares in God's common goodness, that's rooted in God's grace, and that does not begin with what's wrong with us or who we should have been, but begins with an invitation to receive God's gift and to become who we could be. But the thing is that any new information, any new thing, is inevitably going to be filtered through our pre-understanding of the way that things work. And we can see this is the key thing that makes Romans so complicated, because Paul is trying to work through their own pre-understandings of things to help them see the goodness and graciousness of God. Humans are inevitably like this. We always have to understand the new thing in terms of the thing that we already understood along the way. In Romans, what Paul does is his persuasive and rhetorical approach is to start with what his friends in Rome thought things were like, and then showed them how the good and gracious gospel saves them from that and brings them into the life that God longs to give them. And that's going to be our move each week, to start with the image that these folks in Rome had in mind of how God works in the world, and watch while Paul interacts with that and invites them into a better version of things. Not what they thought it was like, but the way this new world that's being created by Jesus' death and resurrection. We'll see in Romans that there's at least 5 different metaphors for how God saves us, and all of them are derived from things that either the Jewish or Gentile members of the community, or both, thought were how the world worked and how God interacts with us. But it's important to note that these are all just metaphors. There's been a great deal of mischief in Christian living and Christian theology of deciding that maybe one of these is actually how it is and the rest are metaphors. Specifically the idea that Jesus was punished and killed on our behalf so that we could be saved. That's a metaphor. Just like being adopted is a metaphor, just like having your debts canceled is a metaphor, just like the one we're going to see today, coming to God entirely by faith is a metaphor. All of them are true in the way that all good metaphors are true, but it's not like one of them is what's actually happening and the others are just metaphors. All of these are actually how God saves us, and all of these are just metaphors along the way. But we're going to see again, in each instance, Paul takes as his starting point the way people thought, and then again, the way that things actually work in the gospel. And so that gospel that Paul here says, and we're going to see this over and over again, comes in 3 parts. And each week we're going to kind of bring the reality of what these people are facing to this great three-part message. The first is that God's promise of this three parts is that he will be our God and we will be his people. And that this promise rests on God's grace and that it belongs to all of us. It is not provisional, it is not conditional, and it is not made more valuable or kept valuable by precarity or scarcity. The second part of this message, of this gospel, is that Jesus' resurrection and death fundamentally changed the way the world worked. God's work in Jesus at the cross and in the empty tomb did not merely give us a better power or methods to survive or even flourish in this existing world. The good news is that God has destroyed the world that was ruled by sin and death and shame and legalism, and invites us to live in a world that is rooted in grace and mercy and goodness. The final part of this good news is that God calls us to respond to this invitation, to this news, with belief, acceptance, and enjoyment. The word that Paul uses most often in Romans is faith, and this week's text is going to reflect a lot on what that particular word means. But I want to leave you with the idea right now that faith is something like a kind of wild trust in who God says he is, and that we are who God says we are. And faith mostly involves just saying, sure, okay, I'll accept it. So, let's take a look at this week's text, which is Romans 4, 13 to 25. Now, as we often do, we're forced to on Sunday mornings, we're jumping into the middle of a pretty dense argument. At the beginning of chapter 4, Paul is wrestling with the belief that the community has that one needs to be connected to Abraham in some particular way. Basically, one needs to be Jewish in order to be a believer. It's not hard how Jewish Christians thought that was the case. Jesus himself was Jewish. So much of his practices you could see as merely reforming Judaism, not ending it. And so it was reasonable for these folks to think that you either needed to be born Jewish or you at least needed to be willing to take on the signs of a Jewish convert. That if you were a male, you had to be circumcised and that you had to keep the law. And he's kind of unpacking that first part at the beginning. He points out that, Abraham was circumcised, but he was God's person before he was circumcised. So maybe you don't quite need to do that. Which was a relief to a lot of folks. And then he also points out that Abraham was a follower of God and was considered righteousness before there was a law. So it's kind of hard to see how obeying a particular legal code legalistically is the mark of faithfulness if the ultimate faithful person didn't do that himself. And what he's trying to do, too, is kind of a judo move, the idea that you have to be one of Abraham's people to be a Christian, which was kind of an exclusive thing. It was a way for the Jews to be like hipsters whose band has suddenly become popular. It's like, oh, we were here early on, right? Before you guys were here. We had the handmade cassette tapes. Which I just realized only 3 of us get that reference. So, sorry. It's a terrible thing to outlive your cultural references. But he demolishes that and makes Abraham and Abraham's experience accessible to all of us. But along the way, he has to battle 2 things. There is a conception of Abraham as kind of the super exemplar of what it means to be faithful. And the passage that we're going to read will go deep into that. But what I want to invite you to do, and give you permission to do in a way that you have probably wished for in other church settings and not felt, is you're going to notice that there is a disparity between the way that Paul talks about Abraham and his faithfulness and how Abraham actually behaved in the stories that we have in Genesis. I noticed that stuff a lot when I was young and was basically either told to shut up or actually what I'm reading is not what it's saying. or I have to read places where Abraham's clearly not on it in Genesis, as he really was, because it says in Romans that he was. But I want to suggest that maybe what Paul's doing here is he's taking a point that he thought people believed and walking into it to flip it on its head and to use it in an entirely different way. So, with all that said, let's take a look at Romans chapter 4. So, for the promise that he would inherit the world did not come to Abraham or his descendants through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. If the adherents of the law were to be heirs, faith is null and the promise is void. For the law brings wrath, but there is no law, therefore there is no violation. So what he's basically arguing with here, and I'll come back to this in a minute, but he's arguing that a kind of legalistic approach. This was common everywhere. If God is going to do something good for us, there must be something that we have to do in return. Or there must be something that we should have done to get God's attention. So in the pagan world, there were all kinds of ways that you served the gods and got their attentions with different kinds of sacrifices and vows and things like that. But within the Jewish world, it was keeping the Torah was a way that you showed that you were one of God's people. And it's tapping into a really deep human experience, right? I mean, maybe you've reached the point where you can just graciously and easily accept things that people want to give to you. But most of us, if we're there, had to travel a long path to get there. If someone wants to buy you a meal, your first thought is usually, oh no, let's go halves. Or immediately think, how can I return this later on and square this along the way? There's something about when something is given to us, we just kind of intuitively feel like we have to square it or even things out along the way. And so it makes sense that people would feel this way along the way. But what he's trying to say here in these opening sentences is that what God wants to give us, the righteousness that God wants to give us, is in fact exactly that. It is a gift. It is not something you have to earn. It's not something you have to grab. You have to receive it. And this is where I think we can start to make the connection between what faith most looks like is a willingness to receive things from God, a willingness to say yes, a willingness to say, sure, I'll take that. So, and he goes on to say some really strong things. Like in verse 14 again, he says, look, if it's legalistically observing the law makes you an heir, then there is no point in faith. It's just a transaction between us and God. And he uses some words that later on in the passage, he's going to develop in some really interesting ways. But he says, no, instead, our status with God is not based on if we're descendants of Abraham. And it's not based on how well we have been able to follow a particular legal code, but it's based on faith. But Paul is smart enough to know that we're inevitably, because of how we're wired, going to turn faith into another kind of behavior, another kind of work, another kind of test, another kind of way of measuring, have I done enough? Have I responded well enough? Has my response been sincere enough? So this is where I want to ask you to pay attention to the disparity between how he's describing Abraham as an ideal, faithful person and how Abraham actually behaved when he was facing these same issues. So he says, for this reason it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all of his descendants. Not only the adherents of the law, Jewish people, you still want to do the law, good for you, he's saying. But to those who share the faith of Abraham, that's all of us, for he is the father of all of us, as it is written, I have made you the father of many nations, in the presence of the God who we believe, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that don't exist. So hoping against hope, he believed that he would become the father of many nations according to what was said. So numerous will your descendants be. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his body, which was already as good as dead, for was about 100 years old. Or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No distrust made him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, being fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. Now, if you remember the narrative of Genesis, that's not what Abraham did at all. He thought Sarah was a non-starter and could trade her out to Pharaoh when they were in Egypt because, yeah, I'm sorry to lose her, but she's barren. What use is she to me as the father of a nation? He may have been nearly dead, but he fathered Ishmael by Sarah's handmaiden Hagar. And most of the time when Abraham talks to God, after the promise in chapter 12 and when it's repeated in 15, it's not him unwavering in faith. It's Abraham going, hey, what's the deal here? Why isn't this happening? And that even when it does happen, he's fine with Ishmael being his heir and not Isaac. God has to kind of talk him into that as well. And so there's an interesting rhetorical way the language shifts here too. And I think what he's doing is he's quoting. He's quoting an understanding of what Paul or the community in Rome thinks that Abraham is like. And so if you're going to be one of God's people, you have to have this unrelenting, unwavering, incredibly intense faith. And what that effectively does is sets up a standard that none of us can meet. Now, I know you were told in youth group that if you just dedicated your life, and if you finally got your quiet time in order, and you stopped thinking about the girl or boy that was preoccupying your thoughts, your faith would rise up to the level that it's supposed to be at. But I think what he's doing here in this passage is creating a discontinuity between what people knew what Abraham was actually like and the way that he was talked about. And it's a way, without explicitly attacking it, a way of dismissing an impossible standard of faith that had been created in that community. So one of the things they had to wrestle with in Romans, if you want to be one of God's people, then you need to have faith like Abraham. And that meant all of these things. No weakness, no wavering, 100% all the time. Where does that leave us? Frustrated and failing, right? Frustrated and failing. No distrust. And so, instead, what he goes on to say, therefore, and there's in verse 22 that, do we have it up here? No.
Yeah, she puts it back on and turns
Okay.
it off when you stop talking.
Yeah. If it can come back up. I'm trying to see what we have up there. Verse 22.
Yep. That was it. Yeah. Right?
Yeah. Oh, good. This version of the text didn't add it in. Therefore, it was reckoned for him by righteousness. There are some translations that add the word faith because they think that he is this example, and he's not along the way. So the point here is that Abraham was God's person, not because of his performance, not because of what he had done, not because he had met an impossible standard that none of us could meet. He was God's person because God had decided to consider him righteousness, not on the basis of Abraham's actions, not on the basis of his faith that had been performed in particular ways, but because God decided. It was not on any decision of Abraham, it was on God's sake. And that's where it moves over to us. So it was reckoned to him, and they were written not for his sake alone, but for ours also. It was reckoned to us who believe in him, who raised Jesus from the dead, who had handed over to death for our trespasses and raised for our justification. What is he saying here, and what is he saying to us? To hear this, that God considered Abraham his person. He made him righteous. That what matters is what God thinks about us and not what we think about ourselves. What matters is what God has told us about who we are and not what others, sometimes even in church settings, have told us who we are. The faith that a lot of us grew up with, that we were told we needed to have, was just another way of qualifying and making precarious God's acceptance of us. And this passage is here to tell us, no, that's not it. That your status with God rests on his gracious decision to accept you and make you his. Not on your performance of any particular thing or your refusal to perform particular things. It does depend on your faith, simply to the extent that you need to accept it and receive this from God. And we need to accept and receive the goodness that God has had for us. So again, back to my initial thing, it's an initial analogy. What God is asking us to do, the good news, the gospel, is something like saying, hey, I'd like to buy you lunch. And what faith is not figuring out a way to pay him back, not figuring out a way to make you return, not figuring out, is there something wrong that he's buying me lunch? But just saying, sure, thank you, and enjoying it. Let's pray.